The gate was locked. Mara Voss climbed it anyway. Her boots hit the mud on the other side, and she did not look back at the car she had left on the roadside, engine still ticking as it cooled. She had a folder under her arm, a shovel over her shoulder, and a wooden post balanced against her hip. She had rehearsed this walk for 11 years. Now her legs remembered every step before her mind caught up. The east meadow stretched out in front of her, gray-green under a sky that could not decide on rain. Somewhere past the tree line was the house, Ashcombe Hall. She had seen it only in photographs until now, all gray stone and old glass, sitting on the hill like it owned the horizon. It did, as far as everyone else was concerned. She reached the center of the meadow and began to dig. The ground fought her. Roots, stone, the memory of every winter this field had survived. She did not stop. Sweat gathered at her collar. She thought of her grandfather's hands, the ones that used to shake near the end, tracing lines on a paper map that no lawyer would ever look at twice. She thought of the word he used to say, low and certain, like it was a fact of nature. Hours. She was 3 feet down when she heard the horse. She did not turn around straight away. She let the sound come closer, let the rider slow, let the silence stretch until it became its own kind of announcement. Only then did she look up, wiping one muddy hand across her forehead, leaving a streak she would not notice until much later. The man on the horse was younger than she expected, and colder than she had hoped. "You," he said, "are standing on private land." "I'm standing on my land," Mara said. He dismounted like a man used to being obeyed by gravity itself, tall, dark-haired, dressed like someone who had never once had to think about the price of anything. His voice had the flat, practiced patience of a man giving someone one chance before he stopped being patient at all. "I don't believe we've met," he said. "I am the Duke of Ashcombe. I know who you are. Then you'll understand why I'm asking you to leave." Mara straightened. She was not tall. She did not need to be. "You dare trespass again, madam," he said, and there was something almost amused buried under the iron in his voice, like he expected this to be the end of the conversation and not the beginning. She smiled. "This land is mine now." For a moment, neither of them moved. Wind pushed through the grass between them. Somewhere behind him, his horse shifted its weight and exhaled, bored already with the two humans deciding something that would take much longer than a horse's patience allowed. "That's an interesting claim," he said finally. "Do you have anything to support it, or is this a performance?" She held up the folder. He did not take it. "I don't discuss estate matters with strangers standing in the mud," he said. "Get off my land, or I will have you removed." "Try it," Mara said. "See what a judge thinks of a duke dragging a woman off a field she owns." Something flickered behind his eyes. Not fear. Ashcombe men did not do fear. Not in public, not ever, she imagined. But something close to it, a recalculation. "What is your name?" he said. It was not a question so much as a demand, dressed as one. "Mara Voss." He said nothing. The name did not seem to mean anything to him, and for a moment she almost laughed at that, at the unfairness of it, that she had grown up hearing his family's name spoken like a curse in her grandfather's kitchen, while his family had never once, not once, said hers. "Voss," he repeated slowly, testing the shape of it. "I don't know that name." "You will." He looked at the hole she had dug, at the fence post lying in the grass, at the folder she still held out like an offering he refused to accept. "I'll have my solicitor contact you," he said, in the tone of a man closing a door. "Good," Mara said. "Tell him to bring the original survey from 1894, not the one your family likes to show people. The real one." That stopped him. Only for a second. But she saw it. A flicker, quickly smothered, the look of a man who has just heard a sentence he was not prepared for and does not yet understand why it landed the way it did. "I don't know what you think you know," he said, "but I would advise you to be very careful making accusations against this family." "I'm not making accusations, Your Grace." She let the title sit there between them, sharp-edged. I'm making a claim. There's a difference. One of them is backed by paper." He mounted his horse again, and for a moment, looking down at her, he seemed to consider saying something else. Whatever it was, he swallowed it. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," Mara agreed. "It really isn't." He rode off toward the tree line without looking back, and she stood there a long moment, watching the space where he had been, before she picked the shovel back up and kept digging. Her arms ached. Her back ached. None of it mattered. By the time the post was in the ground, the sky had made its decision, and rain came down in a fine, cold mist. She did not mind it. She stood there with mud past her wrists and looked at the little wooden marker standing crooked in the grass, and for the first time in 11 years, she let herself cry, just for a moment, just long enough to feel it, before she wiped her face with the back of her hand and walked back to her car. Alaric Ashcombe rode home slower than he had ridden out. He told himself it was the ground, uneven after the recent rain, unsafe for a faster pace. He knew, somewhere under the excuse, that it was not the ground at all. Voss. The name sat in his chest like a stone he had swallowed without meaning to. He had grown up in that house on the hill hearing certain names mentioned only in passing, only in the careful, clipped way his father used to talk about difficult subjects at dinner, the way you might mention a debt everyone agreed not to discuss. He could not remember why the name Voss belonged in that category, only that it did. He found his estate manager, Colm Fairweather, in the study, going through the morning's correspondence with the tired patience of a man who had worked for this family for 30 years and expected nothing pleasant from any given day. "There was a woman on the East Meadow," Alaric said, before Coleman could greet him properly. "Voss, Mara Voss. She's planted a fence post in the middle of the field and claims she owns it." Coleman's hands stopped moving over the papers. Just for a second. But Alaric had known this man his entire life, and he knew what stillness like that meant in him. "You know the name," Alaric said. "I know the name," Colm agreed, carefully, the way a man agrees to something he would rather not. "Then you'll tell me what it means." Colm set down the letter he was holding. He looked for a moment, like a man deciding whether 30 years of loyalty to a family was worth protecting them from a truth, or whether it finally required telling them one. "Sit down, Your Grace," he said. "This will take longer than a minute." Alaric did not sit. He stood by the window instead, looking out at the gray fields rolling down toward the meadow he could not see from here, the one with a fence post standing in it now like an accusation driven into the earth. "Tell me anyway," he said. Outside, the rain kept falling, patient and unbothered, the way rain always is about the quarrels of people who think their claims on the earth mean something more permanent than they do. Colm Fairweather had worked at Ashcombe Hall since before Alaric was born, and in all that time he had never once seen the current Duke's father's old ledgers pulled out from the bottom drawer of the study desk. He pulled them out now. 41 years ago, Colm said, your grandfather bought the East Meadow from a tenant farmer named Ewan Voss. Or that's the story the family tells. And the story we don't tell? Colm hesitated, and in that hesitation, Alaric understood that the next sentence would change something permanent between them. There's a survey, Colm said, an older one. It was done properly, by an independent surveyor, before your grandfather's people redrew the boundary lines. In the old survey, the East Meadow sits on the Voss side of the property line. In the new one, it sits on ours. That's not unusual, Alaric said. Boundaries get redrawn. Land gets sold. There's no sale on record, Colm said quietly. Not for the meadow, only for the smaller strip of woodland beside it. Somewhere between the old survey and the new one, 3 acres moved from the Voss deed to the Ashcombe deed, and nobody can find the paperwork that explains how. The rain had picked up outside. Alaric watched it streak the glass, distorting the shape of the hills beyond, and thought of a woman, standing in the mud, with a folder she had tried to hand him, and he had refused to take. "Why has no one told me this before?" he asked. "Because no one asked, Your Grace, and because the family that lost the land never had the money to fight it. Ewan Voss died 15 years ago. He tried, once, to bring a case. He lost, not because he was wrong, but because he couldn't afford a solicitor good enough to make the argument properly. Your father's people made sure of that. Alaric turned from the window. Made sure how? Coleman's jaw tightened. I wasn't privy to everything, but I know money moved. I know the surveyor who did the original honest work suddenly found himself out of clients in this county. I know Ewan Voss spent the last years of his life telling anyone who would listen that the Ashcombe family had stolen from him, and I know most people stopped listening because it is easier to believe a duke than a poor man with a grudge. And his granddaughter would be Mara, Coleman said. I remember her as a child, actually. She used to walk that meadow with her grandfather every evening. I saw them from the tree line more than once. He'd point at the fence line like he was teaching her scripture. Alaric sat down then, finally, in the chair behind the desk that had belonged to his father and his father's father before him, a desk that had apparently been used, at some point, to sign away a family's land and call it business as usual. I want the original survey, he said, the honest one. Wherever it's buried, find it. It may not exist anymore, Your Grace. Papers like that have a way of disappearing when they're inconvenient. Find it anyway. Coleman nodded and left him alone with the rain and the ledgers and the growing, uncomfortable weight of a name he had never bothered to learn before today. Mara did not sleep that night, though not for the reasons she expected. She had imagined, for 11 years, that the day she finally planted her flag on that meadow, she would feel something like triumph. Instead, she lay awake in her small rented room above the village bakery, staring at a water stain shaped vaguely like a bird, thinking about the Duke's face in the moment before he'd asked her name. He hadn't known. That was the part she kept circling back to. He had genuinely, completely not known who she was, what her family had lost, what his family had taken. She had built him in her mind for over a decade as a villain with a face, and instead she had found a man who looked, for one unguarded second, like someone hearing bad news for the first time. It didn't change anything. She told herself that firmly, twice, like a woman reciting a rule she was afraid of forgetting. It didn't matter if he knew. The land was still stolen. The debt was still owed. A thief's confusion about his own theft did not make the theft smaller. Still, she kept seeing his face. In the morning she went to see Bridie, who ran the flower stall in the village square, and had known Mara since they were both children small enough to hide under the same market table during thunderstorms. "You did it," Bridie said, before Mara had even finished crossing the square. "The whole village heard by breakfast. You planted a fence post on Ashcombe land and told the Duke it was yours." "It is mine." "I believe you," Bridie said, and meant it, which was more than most people in the village had managed over the years. "But you know what happens next, don't you? He's going to come at you with solicitors and money and every advantage a man like that has. What do you have?" "A folder," Mara said, "my grandfather's papers, and a promise I made him before he died. Papers can be lost. Promises can't be filed in court. Then I'll find something that can." Bridie studied her for a long moment, the way old friends study each other when they're trying to work out how worried to be. "You're not just doing this for the land," she said. "You could have sold a claim like that to a solicitor years ago and taken a settlement. You're doing this because you want him to say sorry." Mara didn't answer right away. "I want him to know what his family did," she said finally. "The land is the proof. The apology isn't the point. Making him understand is. And if he never understands, if he just pays you off and moves on, then at least the land goes back to where it belongs," Mara said. "That's enough. It has to be enough." But even as she said it, she wasn't sure she believed herself, and Bridie's face told her that her oldest friend didn't believe her either. The solicitor's letter arrived 4 days later. It was formal, cold, and precisely as threatening as Mara had expected, informing her that the Ashcombe estate considered her actions unlawful and that legal proceedings would follow if the fence post was not removed within a fortnight. She read it twice, then went out to the meadow herself, without asking permission, and sat down beside the post in the wet grass like she was keeping it company. She was still there an hour later when she heard hooves again. This time the Duke came alone, on foot, leading the horse rather than riding it, which she noted without quite understanding why it mattered. He stopped a respectful distance away, closer to being polite than he had managed the first time. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Grace. I've had my estate manager look into the history of this land." Mara's heart moved strangely in her chest, somewhere between hope and old practiced distrust. "And?" Alaric was quiet for a moment, choosing words the way a man chooses footing on ice. "I don't yet know the full truth," he said, "but I know enough to say that I owe your family an explanation, at the very least, possibly more than that." Mara stood up slowly, brushing grass from her knees, watching him with the wary attention of someone who had been disappointed by powerful men before. "That's not what I expected you to say." "It's not what I expected to say either," he admitted, and there was something almost human in the honesty of it, a crack in the polished stone of him that she had not been prepared for. "I would like to see your grandfather's papers. Not as a legal maneuver. I want to understand what happened. Why should I trust you with them?" "You shouldn't, necessarily," he said, "but you can make copies first, if that helps." It was such a small, practical thing to say, so unlike the arrogant man who had ordered her off his land 4 days earlier, that Mara found herself almost smiling despite everything. "You're not what I thought you'd be," she said. "Neither, apparently, is my family's history." They stood there a moment longer, the fence post between them like a small, stubborn monument, and for the first time since she had climbed that locked gate, Mara let herself wonder if this fight might end somewhere other than where she had planned for it to end. She did not let the wondering last long. Old wounds did not heal because a handsome man used a gentle voice. But she let herself wonder, just for a moment, and that alone felt like something had shifted in the ground beneath them both. The storm came in the 3rd week of that strange, careful truce, and it came without any of the warning the weather reports had promised. Mara heard it before she saw it, a low growl of thunder rolling over the hills like something waking up hungry, and by the time she reached the meadow, the sky had turned the color of a bruise. She had come to check the fence post, foolishly, as though a piece of wood needed her protection more than the acres around it did. The rain arrived sideways. Within minutes, the meadow had become a shallow lake, brown water pooling in the low ground where the old drainage ditch had collapsed years ago and never been repaired, because repairing it would have meant someone admitting the ditch belonged to them. She waded out anyway, soaked through, trying to free the fence post before the current could carry it off toward the stream, when she heard someone shouting her name over the wind. Alaric was running toward her through the flooding grass, coat plastered to his shoulders, looking nothing at all like a duke, and everything like a man who had simply seen someone in trouble and decided the title could wait. "Leave it," he shouted. "It's not worth drowning over. It's the only proof I have that's standing in the ground. It's a piece of wood, Mara." It was the first time he had used her given name. Neither of them seemed to notice in the moment, though later, much later, she would remember it as the exact second something between them changed shape. Together they got the post free just as the ditch gave way completely, water rushing down through the break and carrying half the fence line with it, posts tumbling like matchsticks. They stood there, both soaked, both breathing hard, watching a small piece of their argument literally wash away in front of them. "Well," Alaric said, when he'd caught his breath, "that settles the boundary dispute rather more dramatically than either of our solicitors managed." Mara laughed despite herself, a short, surprised sound, and the sound of it seemed to startle them both. "We should get out of this," she said. "Come to the house. Dry clothes at least. I'm not going in your house. Then we'll stand in a storm arguing about pride until one of us catches a fever," he said. "Which, if you're determined to sue my family for stealing your land, would be a rather unfortunate way to lose the case." She went to the house. It was smaller than she expected, once you were inside it, and not just looking up at it from a locked gate. Old, Yes, grand in the way certain buildings simply are when they have stood in one place for 300 years. But there was a fireplace in the kitchen that Nell, the housekeeper, had lit within minutes of them arriving, and there was a blanket handed over without ceremony, and there was tea that tasted like nothing special at all, which somehow made it easier to sit there and drink it. "Your grandfather," Alaric said eventually, once the shivering had stopped and the fire had done its slow work. "Colum remembers him. Says he used to walk the meadow with you every evening." Mara wrapped both hands around her cup. "He taught me the boundary lines, before he taught me to read," she said. "He used to say the land remembers even when the paper forgets." "What happened to him?" "After he lost the case." She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, it was short, plain, unadorned, the way a person speaks about something they have worn smooth from carrying it too long. "He never stopped believing it would come back to us. He just ran out of time to see it." Alaric did not push for more. He seemed to understand, without being told, that the sentence was a door she had opened only part way, and that forcing it further would only make her close it again. "I'm sorry," he said instead. "Not the useless kind of sorry people say to end a conversation. I mean it as a starting point. I don't know yet what I can do to fix what my family did, but I intend to find out." "Why?" Mara asked, and there was real suspicion in it, old and earned. "You could bury this, pay a settlement, make me sign something and never think about the Voss family again. Why bother with the truth?" Alaric considered the question seriously, the way he seemed to consider most things, turning it over before answering. "Because I have spent my whole life being told my family's name means something," he said. "Honor, duty, all the words carved over doorways in this house. I would like, at least once, for those words to mean something real instead of decoration." Outside, the storm rattled the old windows, and somewhere in the walls a draft found its way through, and neither of them said anything else for a while, content, strangely, to simply sit in the warmth and let the silence hold whatever it was that had started growing between them. The next morning brought calm Fairweather to the study with a folder of his own, thin and dust-stained, that he set on the desk like a man laying down something heavier than paper. "I found it," he said, "the original survey. It was misfiled under a different parish name, which I suspect was not an accident." Alaric opened it carefully. The document was exactly what Mara had claimed, a proper survey, dated and signed by an independent surveyor whose name Alaric did not recognize, clearly marking the east meadow inside the Voss boundary. Attached to it, in a different hand, was a second document, unsigned, an early draft of a new boundary line that moved the meadow onto Ashcombe land, with a margin note in his grandfather's handwriting that made Alaric's stomach turn cold. "Settle with Voss quietly. Offer is more than fair given circumstances." There was no record of any offer ever being made. "He knew," Alaric said quietly. "My grandfather knew the meadow wasn't ours, and he took it anyway, and he never even bothered to pay the man he took it from." "It appears so, Your Grace." Alaric sat with that for a long moment, the folder open in front of him, the weight of it heavier than 3 acres of grass had any right to be. "Does Mara know we've found this?" "Not yet." "I want to be the one to tell her." He rode out to the village that afternoon, on his own, without the horse this time, walking the muddy road like a man who had decided that some conversations should not be softened by anything as convenient as ceremony. He found her at the bakery, helping Bridie stack trays behind the counter, flour on her sleeves, looking so ordinary and unguarded that for a moment he almost lost his nerve. "I found the survey," he said, once they'd stepped outside. Mara went very still. "And? You were right, all of it. My grandfather knew the meadow was your family's land, and he took it anyway, and there's a note in his own hand proving he meant to pay your grandfather and never did." For a long moment, Mara said nothing at all. Then, quietly, without drama, she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, and Alaric understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that he was watching 11 years of a woman's certainty finally being believed by the one family who had spent that whole time refusing to. "He used to say that to me," she said, her voice thick, "that the land remembers. I always thought it was just something old men say to comfort themselves. I didn't think I'd ever actually get to prove he was right." "You did," Alaric said. "You were right, and I am genuinely sorry it took you 11 years and a locked gate to make anyone with my name listen." Mara wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, embarrassed by the tears and unwilling to apologize for them either. "What happens now?" "Now," Alaric said, "I take this to my family's trustees, and I tell them we are correcting a wrong, and the meadow goes back to the Voss name, where it should have stayed all along." "Just like that?" "It should be that simple," he admitted. "I don't yet know if it will be." He was right to doubt it, though neither of them knew yet how right. Over the following days, something eased between them that had nothing to do with deeds or surveys or dead grandfathers with unpaid debts. Alaric found reasons to walk the meadow that had nothing to do with the dispute at all. Mara found herself, more than once, letting him. They rebuilt the broken stretch of fence together, on a clear afternoon, post by post, saying little, the silence between them comfortable in a way that surprised them both. At one point Alaric handed her a hammer she hadn't asked for, and their hands brushed, and neither of them mentioned it, and both of them noticed it anyway. "You bring coffee now," Mara said one morning, watching him approach across the grass with 2 cups balanced awkwardly in his hands. "You didn't used to bring coffee." "I didn't used to know you drank it." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed, handing her a cup. "It isn't." She took it anyway, and drank it, and did not ask again, and something about the way she smiled into the steam told him she understood the answer well enough without it being spoken aloud. It was Bridie who said the quiet part out loud, weeks later, watching Mara return from another morning at the meadow with color in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the weather. "You're falling for the man whose family stole your land." "I'm not falling for anyone." "Mara." "It's complicated," Mara admitted, finally, sitting down heavily on a flour sack like the honesty had cost her something physical to say. "He's trying to fix it, really trying. That's not nothing." "It's not everything either," Bridie said gently. "Trying to fix a wrong doesn't erase who benefited from it in the first place. Be careful. Not of him, maybe, of what happens to you if this all falls apart the moment his family says no." Mara didn't answer, because she didn't have one, and because some part of her had already begun to suspect that Bridie's warning was not a hypothetical at all, but a forecast, arriving early, the way storms sometimes do. The trustees' meeting was held in a room Alaric had always found faintly ridiculous, a long table of dark wood surrounded by portraits of Ashcombe men who had never once, in 3 centuries, looked pleased about anything. Gerald Whitmore, the family's longtime solicitor, sat at the far end with the folder of survey documents open in front of him, like a man presenting evidence he already intended to dismiss. Beside him sat Reginald Ashcombe, Alaric's cousin, a man whose interest in the estate had always outweighed his interest in the family that owned it. "I appreciate the sentiment," Whitmore began, once Alaric had finished laying out what he had found. "But sentiment is not how estates are managed. This survey is decades old. The current deed is legally sound. Whatever your grandfather did or did not intend, the Ashcombe name currently, legally, owns that meadow. The current deed is sound because someone buried the honest survey and drew a new boundary that was never properly sold or paid for." Alaric said, "That's not a legal technicality. That's theft with better paperwork." "That's a very generous word to use about your own grandfather," Reginald said, leaning back in his chair with the easy confidence of a man who had never once had to dig his own ditch. "Careful, cousin. Words like that tend to end up in newspapers. Let them. Easy for you to say. You're not the one whose inheritance shrinks by 3 acres and a very unflattering headline." Whitmore cleared his throat, the sound of a professional trying to steer a room back toward business. "Your Grace, I understand you feel a personal obligation here, But the trustee's duty is to the estate as a whole, not to one woman's grievance, however sympathetic. I would recommend we contest any claim Miss Voss brings, on the grounds that the current deed stands, and any historical irregularity is outside any reasonable statute of limitations. You want to fight her in court, knowing she's right. I want to protect the estate, Whitmore said evenly. That is my job, Your Grace, whether or not it is comfortable. Around the table, heads nodded, slow and practiced, the particular agreement of people who had decided something before the meeting had even begun. We could offer her a settlement, Reginald suggested, almost bored. Small enough not to set a precedent, generous enough to make her sign away any further claim. It happens all the time. People like her don't usually turn down cash for silence. Alaric felt something cold settle behind his ribs. People like her. You know what I mean. I don't think I do, Alaric said. Explain it to me. Reginald had the good sense, at least, to look faintly uncomfortable under the sudden focus of his cousin's attention, though not uncomfortable enough to stop talking entirely. I only mean that a woman in her position generally wants money more than she wants principle. Offer her enough, and this whole unfortunate business disappears quietly. She has spent 11 years fighting for that meadow, with nothing but her grandfather's papers and a shovel, Alaric said. She is not going to disappear quietly for a check, and frankly, I would think less of my own family if that is genuinely the best solution any of you can imagine. The room went quiet, in the particular way rooms go quiet when the most powerful person in it has just made his position uncomfortably clear. Your Grace, Whitmore said carefully, I would remind you that you do not have sole authority here. The trust requires majority agreement among the named trustees for any transfer of estate land. If this comes to a vote, sentiment alone will not carry it. Then, let it come to a vote. It did not go the way he hoped. Word of the vote, and of the argument that preceded it, reached the village faster than Alaric could manage the news himself, the way important gossip in small places always seems to travel on its own private, invisible roads. By the time he reached the bakery that evening, Mara already knew. She was waiting for him outside, arms folded, her face set in an expression he had not seen on her since the day she'd stood in the meadow refusing to move. You're contesting it, she said, before he could speak. Your family is going to fight me in court over land you already admitted your grandfather stole. The trustees are considering it. I voted against it. But you didn't stop it. I don't have the authority to stop it alone, Alaric said. The trust requires. I don't care what the trust requires, Mara said, and her voice had the low, controlled heat of someone who has been disappointed by exactly this kind of explanation too many times before. I care that you sat in a room with the people managing your family's stolen land, and the outcome of that meeting is that they might drag me to court over 3 acres your own grandfather admitted, in writing, belonged to my family. I know how this looks. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what your family has always done. Say the right words, bring coffee, rebuild a fence, and then, when it actually costs you something, fall back behind lawyers and votes and majorities. That's not fair. Isn't it? Mara's eyes were bright, furious, close to something that wasn't quite tears, and wasn't quite rage either, some third thing made of both. You could end this with one signature. You told me yourself. And instead you're standing here explaining trust structures to me like I'm supposed to find that comforting. Alaric opened his mouth to defend himself, some careful, reasonable sentence already forming about process and legality and the limits of ducal authority, and then he stopped. Because she was right, and he knew it, and defending himself would only prove her point louder than any argument from Whitmore ever could. You're right, he said instead. Mara blinked, thrown, clearly braced for an argument that hadn't arrived. I have spent this whole time thinking I was doing something difficult and brave by simply agreeing the truth was true, Alaric went on, quiet now, stripped of the polish that usually came so easily to him. That was never the hard part. The hard part is what I do when it actually costs me something. And so far, I haven't done it. So what are you going to do? I don't know yet, he admitted, but I am not going to stand in a room and let anyone speak about you the way my cousin did today, and I am not going to let a vote decide something I already know is right. That's not an answer, Alaric. It was the first time she had used his given name. Neither of them mentioned it, though both of them heard it land, and for a moment the anger in her seemed to falter, just slightly, before she caught it and steadied herself again. I need more than good intentions, she said. My grandfather had a lifetime of people telling him they understood, that they were sorry, that they would look into it. He died still waiting for someone with power to actually use it. I won't wait that long. You won't have to. You keep saying things like that. Prove it. He didn't have an answer ready, not one good enough for the moment, and she seemed to sense it, because she turned and walked back into the bakery without waiting for one, leaving him standing in the darkening street with the uncomfortable, clarifying knowledge that being sorry had never once, in the whole history of his family's name, actually given anyone their land back. That night he sat alone in the study with his grandfather's ledger open in front of him, and the vote scheduled for the following week, weighing on him like a stone he had swallowed and could not put down. Colm found him there, past midnight. You're still up, Your Grace. I'm trying to work out how to stop a vote. I don't have the votes to stop. Colm considered this for a long moment, standing in the doorway with the particular patience of a man who had spent 30 years watching Ashcombe men wrestle with decisions their fathers had made easy by never having a conscience about them. There is one thing you do have, Colm said finally, that no vote can take away from you. What's that? The land is legally in trust, yes, but your personal claim to it, your right to renounce any Ashcombe interest in a specific parcel before it's formally contested, that authority sits with you alone, Your Grace. Not the trustees, you. If you withdraw the estate's claim publicly, before any vote takes place, there's nothing left for them to vote on. Alaric sat up slowly. Say that again. You can give it back yourself, before the vote, before Whitmore can build his case. All you have to do is mean it enough to move faster than they can. For the first time in days, something like relief moved through Alaric's chest, sharp and clean, cutting through the fog of committee rooms and careful legal language that had swallowed the whole week. Get Whitmore in the morning, he said, not to ask permission, to tell him what I've already decided. Colm allowed himself, for the first time that night, something close to a smile. Yes, Your Grace. Gerald Whitmore did not take the news well. You cannot simply announce this before the vote, he said, standing in the study the next morning with the stiff posture of a man watching his careful plans dissolve in real time. The trustees will see it as you overriding the process entirely. I am overriding the process entirely, Alaric said. You told me yourself that my personal authority over a disputed parcel exists independent of the trustees' vote. I'm using it. Reginald will be furious. Reginald can be furious in private. This is not his decision to make, and it was never his land to be furious about. There will be talk, Whitmore warned. People will say the Duke of Ashcombe gave away part of the estate over a personal entanglement, not principle. Let them say it, Alaric replied. It will at least be closer to the truth than what my grandfather told people about how he acquired that meadow in the first place. Whitmore studied him for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, reluctant respect creeping in around the edges of his professional disapproval. You understand this cannot be undone once it's public. Once you renounce the claim, there's no quiet negotiation afterward, no settlement, no walking it back. Good, Alaric said. I'm tired of things in this family being quiet. The announcement went out 3 days later, not as a grand public statement, but as a formal letter to the parish land registry, copied to the trustees, copied to Mara Voss, stating plainly that the Ashcombe estate withdrew any and all claim to the 3 acres known as the East Meadow, acknowledging the original survey as accurate and the prior transfer as improperly conducted, and returning full and unencumbered title to the Voss family name. Mara read it standing in the bakery doorway, Bridie peering over her shoulder, both of them silent long enough that a customer had to ask twice whether the ovens were free. "He actually did it," Bridie said quietly. "Before the vote. Before anyone could stop him." Mara said nothing. She read the letter a second time, then a third, as though the words might change if she looked at them long enough, might reveal some hidden condition, some catch that made this too good to be a plain and simple truth. There wasn't one. She walked to the meadow that same afternoon, alone, the letter folded in her coat pocket like something too fragile to be trusted to a bag. The fence post still stood where she and Alaric had rebuilt it, straighter now than the day she'd first driven it into the ground with shaking, furious hands. She knelt beside it and pressed her palm flat against the wood, the way her grandfather used to press his hand against the same soil decades ago, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to prove, nothing left to fight for except the quiet, enormous fact of having finally won. "You'd have liked this part," she said out loud, to no one, to the grass, to the memory of a man who had died still waiting, the part where someone finally listened. She was still there when Alaric arrived, on foot again, without the horse, the way he always seemed to come to her now. "I saw the letter," she said, without turning around. "I meant every word of it." "I know." She stood, brushing grass from her knees, the way she had that first day, though everything about the gesture felt different now. "Why did you do it before the vote? You could have waited. Let the trustees agree properly, made it clean. Because clean would have taken months, and you had already waited 11 years, Alaric said. "I decided I would rather be criticized for moving too fast than be responsible for one more year of you standing in a field with nothing but paperwork nobody would read." Mara looked at him for a long moment, the wind moving between them the same way it had the very first day, except nothing about the silence now carried the same weight of threat it once had. "You'll take criticism for this, from your own family, your name in newspapers, probably not kindly." "Probably," Alaric agreed. "I find I mind it less than I expected to." "Why?" "Because for the first time since I inherited this title, I did something with it that I'm not ashamed of," he said. "That's worth more to me than whatever Reginald says at dinner for the next 6 months." Mara pulled the deed transfer from her coat pocket, held it a moment, then folded it carefully and tucked it away again, safe. "I want to plant something here," she said. "Not just the post. Something that grows. My grandfather always meant to, but he ran out of years." "What did he want to plant?" "An oak. He said oaks remember longer than people do." "Then we should plant an oak," Alaric said, simply, as though it were the most obvious next step in the world, and perhaps, between the two of them, it was. They planted it together the following week, in a hole considerably smaller than the one Mara had dug that first furious afternoon, the sapling barely taller than her knee, its future entirely invisible in its present. Bridie came to watch, arms crossed, unable quite to hide how pleased she was, despite months of careful warnings. Calm came too, standing a respectful distance back, the closest thing to sentimental that 30 years of quiet service had ever allowed him to look. "It won't be much to look at for years," Mara said, patting the soil down around the young roots. "Neither was this whole situation, 6 months ago," Alaric said. "And look how that turned out." Mara laughed, the sound easy now in a way it hadn't been in the beginning, and for a moment neither of them said anything else, content to stand together over a small, stubborn tree that would, if it was given enough time and enough seasons, one day stand taller than either of them and remember everything they could not. "Can I still walk this land?" Alaric asked eventually, half joking, watching her straighten from the fresh soil, "now that it's officially, completely, entirely yours?" Mara considered the question with the same careful seriousness she brought to everything that mattered. "Only if you knock first," she said. "That seems fair." "It is fair," she agreed. "It's the first fair thing to happen to this meadow in 40 years. He reached for her hand, not quickly, not with any performance of romance, simply the way two people reach for each other after finally putting down something heavy they had both, separately, carried too long. She let him take it. Above them, the sky had cleared into the kind of pale, washed blue that only comes after a long stretch of rain, and below their joined hands, in soil that had finally settled where it belonged, the small oak stood exactly where it was always meant to grow, patient, rooted, and entirely unbothered by how long it had taken the truth to reach it. It was not, in the end, a story about land at all. It never really had been. It was a story about a name finally spoken correctly, a debt finally paid in full, and two people who had once stood on opposite sides of a fence line discovering, slowly and without either of them quite planning it, that the truest ground either of them had ever stood on was the one they had built honestly, together, once all the old false boundaries had finally been allowed to fall away.